Raspberry Cave Incident. On the morning of August 31st, 2015, four experienced cavers gathered at the entrance of Raspberry Cave in Arizona. Bob Goforth, Mark Pansing, Adam Zipkin, and Mike Van Note were eager to explore the cave's narrow passages. Their goal was to dig through mud and rock in hopes of discovering new sections of the cave. They were armed with tools, ropes, and headlamps. After checking their gear, they made their way toward the cave entrance. Raspberry Cave had an entrance barely wide enough to squeeze through. Late in the morning, they squeezed through the cave's narrow entrance. This led them into a small room just large enough to sit in. From there, they went down into a much larger room with massive boulders wedged into the ceiling above them. At the base of this room was a narrow 10-foot climb down into a smaller chamber. This led to a crawl space about 12 feet long, connecting them to yet another small room. The second small room had a promising lead. The four men began digging out wet mud and rocks. They passed the debris back through the tight crawl space. As they worked, exhaustion began to set in. Concerns about the stability of the cave wall started to grow. The ceiling above where they were working was made of unstable limestone. They realized it might not be safe to continue. Deciding to call it a day, they began packing up their tools. Bob Goforth was the first to exit, making his way back through the crawl space and out of the cave. Mark Pansing was next, climbing up toward the larger room while passing tools ahead of him. As he was working his way out, his shoulder bumped the boulder. The massive rock above him groaned and slid. It pinned his head between the limestone and the cave wall. His face was smashed against the rough stone. The jagged edges bit into his skin as his helmet strap dug painfully into his throat. This restricted his breathing. He could feel the immense pressure building. The boulder threatened to crush him with every second. He couldn't move and he couldn't breathe properly. Every breath he took scraped his face against the sharp rock. Panic set in. He tried to loosen his chin strap, but his hands shook and the strap wouldn't budge. He called out to Mike Van Note, who was still in the crawlway below. Van Note hurried to him and found Pansing trapped. His face was pressed painfully against the rock and his footing was unstable. Pansing's chin strap was keeping him stuck and choking his throat. Despite his efforts to undo it, it wouldn't release. Pansing asked for a knife to cut the strap. As Van Note passed it up, the situation suddenly changed. With a loud crack, the boulder shifted again. This freed Pansing's head, but sent mud and debris tumbling down into the room below. Rocks clattered and splashed into the wet mud as Van Note scrambled back to avoid the falling debris. Thankfully, the massive boulder didn't fall completely. It wedged itself into the space above them, creating a dangerous but stable position. For a tense moment, they held their breath, waiting to see if the entire structure would collapse. The remaining cavers knew they couldn't move the boulder on their own. For 20 minutes, they waited, hoping Goforth would return. Fortunately, Goforth came back into the cave to check on them after noticing their delay. When he learned they were trapped, they carefully passed him a crowbar from below. With the boulder now wedged in place, Bob Goforth wasted no time. Armed with the crowbar, he began carefully widening the narrow space. His every move was careful and precise. The cavers below could hear the scraping of metal against rock as Goforth worked. Mud and small rocks occasionally fell down, raising the tension even further. Mike Van Note kept his eyes on the ceiling, ready to shout a warning if the unstable rock shifted again. Finally, Goforth managed to move the boulder into a more stable position. The rock shifted slightly, sending another wave of mud down into the room, but this time it held. The three trapped cavers felt relieved. Their ordeal was nearly over. One by one, they carefully climbed up the now wider space. Each move was calculated to avoid disturbing the boulder any further. The climb felt slow, their bodies tired and covered in mud, but as they emerged into the larger room, the sense of relief was clear. They had escaped what could have been a fatal disaster. Sinking River Cave Incident. On September 1st, 2015, a man decided to take his small cattle dog on an adventure to Sinking River Cave. As they went near the cave, the dog's playful curiosity became dangerous. With one careless misstep, the cattle dog tumbled into a blind pit. It was a 169-foot drop into darkness. The man stood at the edge, staring down into the deep hole. Panic set in, but instead of trying to save his dog, he assumed the worst. He thought his dog didn't survive the fall. Instead of making a rescue attempt, he walked away. The truth was completely different. The dog had survived the fall. She called out to her owner, but he never heard her cries. For 2 days, the small cattle dog stayed alive. She was trapped in the Sinking River Cave without food or water. At every sound, she rushed to the narrow opening of the pit. She gazed upward, wanting to see rescue coming. 3 long days passed before someone finally came. A group of cavers arrived at the same cave system. The group included Mel and Edie Pumplin, Rich Pumplin, Mary Klaus, John Scow, and Becky Kaufman. They wanted to explore the very pit that had swallowed the dog. They had no idea about the hidden tragedy below. They prepared for a normal day of caving. Rich Pumplin was the first to go down on a rope. As he went into the pit, he heard something alive. His voice echoed back to the team above. Mel, listening from the surface, recognized the soft tone Rich used when talking to animals. They thought it was a small creature, maybe a chipmunk. When Rich returned to the surface, his expression told a different story. "There's a dog down there," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Mary Klaus volunteered volunteered to go down and help. She grabbed a large backpack and some snacks that might be good for a dog. She went down into the pit on a rope. When she reached the bottom, her heart sank at the sight. There was a small, weak cattle dog looking up at her with tired eyes. The dog had no visible injuries. When Mary spoke softly to her, something amazing happened. The dog's tail began to wag. Mary fed her a few snacks, and despite the dog's weak state, the two connected instantly. Initially, the team thought about using a rope system to pull the dog up, but they quickly realized how scary that would be for the poor animal. Being dragged up against rough rock walls was not an option. Instead, Mary decided she would carry the dog out on her back. As they carefully placed the dog inside the backpack, the little cattle dog rested her head against Mary's shoulder. With the dog secured, Mary began the long, steady climb out of the pit. When they reached the surface, the little dog jumped from the backpack with new energy. The rescuers couldn't help but smile as they watched her. Her happiness seemed like her way of saying thank you. They tried to guide her back to camp, thinking she might need more help, but the dog had other ideas. She ran off in the opposite direction. The owner was overwhelmed when they told the story. He had believed his beloved dog was gone for good. He was too heartbroken to even attempt a rescue. But 3 days later, to his absolute shock, she appeared at his home. Her tail was wagging and her eyes were filled with forgiveness. It was miraculous. Black Cave Incident. Thomas Benning loved exploring caves. In April 1995, he went to Black Cave in Arizona by himself. He had been to this cave before, so he felt safe. He only brought a lamp and no helmet. Thomas entered the cave and took a side path he had never tried. After an hour of crawling, he got lost. He tried to find his way back, but couldn't. His lamp started to flicker and then went out completely. Thomas was trapped in total darkness deep underground. He lit matches one by one to see where he was going. When his matches ran out, he was in darkness again. He crawled around feeling the walls with his hands. Thomas left pieces of his clothes behind to mark where he had been. He hadn't eaten or drunk water for a long time and felt very weak. Thomas found a crack in the rock that looked like it might lead out. He lowered himself into the narrow crack. His hips got stuck between the rock walls and he tried to push himself up but couldn't move. Thomas was trapped and couldn't get free. He was alone and no one could hear him call for help. His wife called the police when he didn't come home. The police searched for him but couldn't find him. They found his car near Black Cave but couldn't find Thomas. The rescue team searched the cave but missed the path he took. After many days, they stopped looking for him. Thomas died alone in the cave. In December 1996, 3 cavers were exploring Black Cave. They found burned matches and pieces of clothing. They followed the trail deeper into the cave. The cavers found Thomas's body stuck in the narrow crack. He had been trapped there for almost 2 years. They called the police right away. A team went into the cave and brought Thomas's body out. His wallet proved it was really Thomas Benning. Knox Cave Incident. In January 1970, 5 people went to explore Knox Cave. Knox Cave was famous for a very tight tunnel called the Gun Barrel. The gun barrel was only 18 inches wide and 60 feet long. The cave entrance was a hole in the ground. One by one, they went down into the dark, cold cave. 3 people decided to try crawling through the gun barrel. One of them was Peter Vons, who was 14 years old. This was Peter's first time in a cave. He wanted to prove he could do it like the older cavers. Peter watched as the others crawled into the tight tunnel. When it was Peter's turn, he took a deep breath and crawled in. The tunnel was much tighter than he expected. His body scraped against the rough rock walls. The air was hard to breathe and he felt squeezed from all sides. Peter used his elbows and knees to move forward inch by inch. He was only 8 feet from the end when something went wrong. Peter's knee slipped into a crack in the cave floor. At first he thought he could pull it out easily, but when Peter tried to move his knee, it was completely stuck. Peter started to panic and called for help. The people ahead of him heard his voice and turned around. When they realized Peter was stuck, they tried to help him, but Peter's body was blocking the entire tunnel. No one could move forward or backward past Peter. They tried pulling on Peter to free him. Every time they pulled, Peter screamed in pain. They had to stop because they were hurting him. The group was stuck in the cold, narrow tunnel. Hours passed and everyone was getting very cold. Outside the cave, the other 12 people were worried. One person went into the cave to check on them. When he found them trapped, he ran back to get help. Police officers and firefighters came to the cave. They saw that this was a very difficult rescue. The tunnel was too narrow for rescuers to fit inside. Hours went by as they tried different ways to free Peter's knee. At 8:30 at night, the rescuers had a new idea. They poured the soapy water around Peter's stuck knee. Everyone worked together to pull Peter's leg very carefully. Finally, Peter's knee started to move. With one last gentle pull, his knee came free from the crack. One by one, all 3 people crawled out to safety. Buzzard Roost Cave Incident. William Coughlin was 27 years old. He was an environmentalist and loved camping. William and his friends James and Kevin decided to explore Buzzard Roost Cave in Kentucky. The cave seemed very exciting in the brochure. On May 28, 1993, the 3 friends traveled to Cave City, Kentucky. They were interested in the large cave network there. The brochure offered 2 tours. There was a historic tour for easy exploring. There was also a wild cave tour for brave people. They first chose the historic tour. Before starting, they signed a form. This form said the cave operators were not responsible if something went wrong. Kevin decided to stay above ground. William and James completed the historic tour. Then they chose the wild cave tour despite warnings from the guide about its dangers. The group was led by a guide named Dave Harden. Each person got a helmet with a flashlight. The guide said everyone needed to stay close together. As they went deeper, the cave's challenges became clear. After squeezing through a narrow passage, they found the first of 2 ladders. This was a 30-foot cable ladder with wooden rungs. The guide led the way and they carefully went down. Then they crawled a short distance to reach the second ladder. William was 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. He struggled to fit through the narrow tunnels. William got stuck at times. After 45 minutes, they reached the second ladder. This was a 60-foot aluminum ladder also attached to a rock wall. While taking pictures on the second ladder, William stepped onto an unstable ledge. The ledge broke and William fell about 50 feet. He hit his head and was knocked unconscious. Everyone panicked as the cave guide called for help on his radio. The group waited anxiously for rescue. William woke up, but he was confused and in terrible pain. He was bleeding heavily from a severe head injury. The group tried to comfort William. The guide tried to give basic first aid. The cave's depth made it hard for rescuers to reach them quickly. The guide kept saying that help was on the way, but tension filled the air as William's condition got worse. As time passed, James and the guide knew they had to act fast. William's condition made it impossible for him to climb the ladders to the entrance, so they chose a risky alternative route. This path was rarely used because of its dangerous narrow sections, twists, and sharp rock formations. It was challenging even for someone who was not hurt. They had no other choice because every minute counted. Amazingly, they managed to get William through the first part of the narrow passage. Next, they faced dangerous V-shaped rock formations. James went through first, crawling on his belly. Then he helped William, who entered head first. William's fear and pain got worse as he struggled to move forward. The sharp rock edge dug into his stomach. William was stuck and could not move. James and the guide were horrified. They were seeing William in trouble for the second time. William begged for help, his voice full of pain. His lungs were compressed against the rocky walls. The guide told James to inform the cave owner about the serious situation. Finally, after a painful wait, the rescue team could be heard in the distance. They reached William and checked his critical condition. They carefully put William on a stretcher. They began the difficult journey out of the cave, trying not to hurt him more. As they came out into the bright sunlight, the medical team took over. They rushed William to the hospital. Tragically, William died from his injuries the next day. Jonathan Cave Incident. Jonathan Cole was a 27-year-old outdoor enthusiast. His best friend Ferguson Lahar was 26 years old. Ferguson often joined Jonathan on cave trips. This cave had narrow, unpredictable passages that made it a true challenge. The journey began on a cool, clear morning. The entrance was a dark, gaping hole in the side of a cliff. It was barely visible among the rocks and boulders. With their headlamps lighting the way, they went down into the cave. The first passage was wide enough for them to walk side by side, but soon it began to narrow. The walls closed in around them. The rock was cold and damp to the touch. As they went deeper, the cave started showing its true nature. The passageways twisted and turned in all directions. Some were so tight that they had to squeeze through sideways. Their bodies were pressed uncomfortably against the rock. Despite the challenges, they kept going. Hours passed as they navigated the winding tunnels. Eventually, they reached a point where the tunnel split into 2 narrow passages. One went to the left and one went to the right. After a brief discussion, they decided to take the left path. They believed it would lead them to a beautiful chamber. The left passage was immediately more difficult than the others. It was a low, narrow tunnel that forced them to crawl on their stomachs. Halfway through the passage, Jonathan was leading and realized something was wrong. The tunnel was narrowing even more. He could barely move forward. Jonathan tried to back up, but the tight space made it nearly impossible. He was stuck. Panic began to set in as Jonathan struggled to free himself. He called out to Ferguson, who was a few feet behind him. His voice echoed through the tight space. Ferguson tried to reach out to help, but the narrow passage limited his movement. The 2 men were trapped in the belly of the cave. It was squeezing the air from his lungs. His muscles strained as he tried to wiggle free. They realized they had made a mistake by not bringing a third person. This is the golden rule of caving. One person stays with the stuck person while the third gets help. In a final desperate attempt, Ferguson tried to push Jonathan forward. He hoped they could force their way through the narrowing tunnel, but the passage was unforgiving. The rock seemed to tighten its grip even further. Jonathan cried out in pain as the walls tore his clothes and skin. Ferguson realized they were out of options. He made the hardest decision of his life. Ferguson told Jonathan that he would try to back out of the passage and go for help. Jonathan, barely able to speak, agreed. He urged Ferguson to go. With great effort, Ferguson began to inch backward through the tight passage. It was a slow, painful process. Every movement was a struggle. Ferguson finally made his way out of the narrow tunnel. By the time Ferguson came out of the cave, he was exhausted and confused. Ferguson contacted the rescue team immediately. A team of rangers who were the nearest were sent to help. They gathered their gear and followed Ferguson back to the cave. When they finally reached Jonathan, hours had passed since Ferguson had left him. The rescuers found him unconscious, still wedged in the narrow tunnel, but Jonathan was alive. They chipped away the rocks that surrounded Jonathan. They used ropes to pull him out. The pulling went on for a long time. Eventually, Eventually, they were able to get Jonathan out of his misery. Jonathan was rushed to the hospital. It took him weeks to recover. Lechuguilla Cave Incident. Emily Davis Mobley was a 40-year-old experienced caver. She went on an expedition to map unknown sections of Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico. Lechuguilla is one of the deepest and most complex caves in the world. Emily and her team went into the cave to explore and map new areas. They navigated through tight squeezes, jagged rocks, and vertical drops. After hours of exploration, the team reached a remote section of the cave. This area was rarely visited because it was very difficult. Emily led the way, squeezing through a narrow passage. The walls pressed against her as she moved forward. Her helmet scraped against the ceiling. Emily tried to move through an even tighter spot. She placed her hand on a massive boulder to move up. The boulder had been loosened by years of dripping water. The massive boulder slipped and crashed down on her leg. It jammed her leg into a crevice. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. She was miles deep into the cave, far from any help. The rest of the team realized something had gone wrong. They came to help and moved the massive boulder off her leg. As hours passed, the pain in her leg got worse. The doctor on her team put a splint on her leg. Now they had to figure out how to get her out. A message was sent to the surface. Soon a full-scale rescue operation started. The rescue was very challenging. The cave's complex layout and extreme depth meant it took hours just to reach Emily. Rescuers had to navigate through the same tight passages. They carried heavy equipment and medical supplies. They knew any wrong move could make her condition worse. They used ropes and pulleys to slowly move her. They were 2 miles deep in the earth. Emily had gotten her senses back. She had been on several rescue missions before. This was the first time she was being rescued. Emily was very experienced, so she led her own rescue. She instructed the team how they should get her out. She even requested food because she was starving. The rescuers created a makeshift stretcher. They began the difficult journey back to the surface, all while carrying Emily safely. After 3 days of effort, the team finally neared the cave entrance. Emily was awake for 30 hours during the final stages of her evacuation. Emily was immediately taken to a hospital. Doctors treated her leg injuries.